Sonic, the heart of your system.
I'm the awarded for Kit Guru. This case from Cooler Master is the MasterBox NR400, a micro ATX case. And when it was offered to Kit Guru, my first instinct was to say, well, okay if you must, because of course you need a micro ATX motherboard to go inside. They're actually quite thin on the ground. You could of course put a mini ITX board inside, but if you're going to do that, why not just have a mini ITX build and go the whole hog, go really small. So ATX, you can put a smaller board inside. Micro ATX, you're kind of obliged to go with the micro ATX form factor, and that really limits your options. So as I say, I was a bit particularly as I was well aware that on the same day the NR400 launches, Cooler Master is also launching the NR600, which is an ATX. It's like, well, that seems more appealing. And then they let the cat out of the bag. They sent me over some documentation that shows that the NR600 is actually a derivative of an existing case. This, on the other hand, is a completely new design. It looks similar to its bigger brother NR600, but internally there are all sorts of bits and pieces that are quite different. Now that appeals to me. The front panel is a full mesh design. If I just pull that off, pops loose. It does not have a separate filter. The front panel is the filter. Cooler Master makes the point that the rather dull 120mm black fan that's behind, therefore has no RGB, doesn't show through the front panel. If you put RGB behind the front panel, you get a kind of iridescent thing going on, which I believe we saw at CES with one or two of their demo builds. And then the main glass panel simply comes away, captive thumb screws, and off. So you have a 120 fan at the front, a 120 fan at the rear, a magnetic dust filter on the top. As I say, the front panel is filtered, but it's kind of in one piece. And then when you look at the chassis, you think to yourself, goodness me, does that not look just a little bit Fantex Eclipse-ish? One piece of steel forms the power supply cover and the chassis itself, the motherboard tray rather. If we spin the case around, remove the rear panel, again captive thumb screws, just steel, no noise deadening material. And there we see we have a drive bay down there which can actually accommodate 3 drives. That's removable. Earlier cases from Cooler Master would have that fixed and you have to slide the drives in and then secure the screws. So that whole caddy comes out. We've also got a couple of SSD mounts here. And at the front we have space for either a 240 or 280 radiator or liquid cooler. There's another version of the NR400 that comes with an optical drive bay. This apparently is a territorial thing. Certain markets such as Germany, they like their optical drives. Here in the UK, not so much. I'm more happy to do without the drive bay and max out the cooling. That suits me very nicely. Moving to the front I/O panel, we have a power button that's shaped like the Cooler Master logo. That, I'm quite confident, is the reset button. A pair of Type A USB 3.0s or 3.1 Gen 1s if you must. The headset jack is a 4-pole that combines all the functions in a single jack. I understand in the accessory pack there is an adapter, which means you can use any headset with this one jack. Initial impressions of the Micro ATX NR400 are that it is a budget case where the bill of materials has been cut down to keep costs to a minimum. Nonetheless, there are some quirks about it. For example, you can see that the front and the rear fans have 2 different designs. That looks to me like the front is more of an air pressure and the back is more of an air flow. We have full filtration front and top, albeit done in a relatively budget manner. Question is how well it works. There appear to be plenty of storage bays. You have plenty of options for installing loads of liquid cooling. Nonetheless, I'm seeing new design, I'm seeing budget. The fact of the matter is the price is £84.99, which is not budget. That is fighting territory for mid-tower ATX models. Again, Micro ATX, thin on the ground, niche. So the fact the price is rather higher than you might expect, that is not necessarily the end of the world. But we'll have to see how the build goes, because that could decide whether this is a success or a failure. I've hit a snag. I've put the fans inside the frame of the chassis. The specification definitely says you can put them on the outside. There is indeed space behind the front panel for the fans to go there. The reason I didn't do that initially is because cable management. Where do the cables from the fans go? They after all have to connect to the motherboard or some sort of fan controller. And that, I'm quite sure, is the reason why Cooler Master supplies this extension cable. So you can put your fans here and here, hook up the cables there, trail this down, and then you connect it to Molex power, so they're constant full speed fans. And I looked at that initially and thought, I don't want to use that, put it to one side, and didn't sort of think it through, which is now the fans are inside. I don't want them inside, I want them outside where they're visible behind the front panel. So I'm going to have a little rethink. I've moved the radiator down, which means we have a gap above and below. Cables from the top fan now trail over the top, bottom go underneath, hook up behind, which means that we now have more space inside. So my mighty Vega 64 can now squeeze in place. I had a couple of false starts, but that's the MasterBox NR400 build finished, and the question now is, what do I think about it? You're in the wrong video. Get out of here. My conclusion about the NR400 was going to dwell on the price, because £85 just seemed like far too much money for this case, and the whole concept of micro ATX, with a few points about relatively small details about the case itself. And literally as I was sitting down to do this conclusion, Cooler Master emailed me to say, actually the pricing you were sent is incorrect. It's not £84.99 for the NR400, it's £59.99. The NR600, the ATX version, is £69.99, £10 more. Difference between £85 and £60 obviously is £25. But when you allow for packaging, VAT, freight and all those other bits and pieces, it means that the actual case itself, in my mind, has now fallen by more than half in cost. That is a colossal amount to go down by, and it's a very, very good thing. Cooler Master has just saved themselves from a somewhat unpleasant conclusion to this review, so that's good timing. So, various complaints I had, minor complaints relatively speaking, such as the two dumb black fans, no RGB. That just goes out of the window. For £60, that's not really a problem. It would be nice to have a bit of RGB. Not a problem. The build quality is perfectly okay. When I was putting on the side panels and I noticed that they didn't quite line up with the front and such, like, I was thinking, oh, that's a bit of a shame. This is, after all, a mid-price case. It's not, it's a budget case, so suddenly I don't care quite so much about that. It is quite noisy. Certainly in this configuration, it's now got 5 fans in it, 2 in the front, 2 in the top, 1 at the rear, and there is no noise deadening whatsoever. This can indeed get quite noisy. On the other hand, cosmetically, aesthetically, I quite like it. Building into it was not a nightmare. A double negative I appreciate, but building into small cases can be tricky. So for example, reaching under the graphics card to get to any of the front panel headers, that's going to be awkward. You're going to have to remove the graphics card. In an ATX, you literally reach into the lower part of the case. Stuff like that is just inherent to micro ATX, and as you'll probably know, with mini ITX is even worse. The sorts of details that Cooler Master spelled out in their reviewer's guide, talking about the differences between the NR400 and NR600, this being the new design, the NR600 being a repurposed design, was actually fascinating to see. Things like the power supply mounts have been slightly offset to give you a little bit more cable management space. Around the back of the case there are clear channels where the cables are meant to run. I mean, there aren't any hook and loop straps and such like, which make it blooming obvious close, but nonetheless, put the cables in this area, it works. And it does lend itself that way. You are naturally inclined to put the cables in certain positions. I'm not going to say that it works 100% because there is not a lot of space to put quite a lot of stuff. But nonetheless, it is crystal clear that this new design from Cooler Master, they have worked on various points. It's just intriguing to see how their cases are evolving, albeit I'd say blooming slowly. When we saw Phanteks Eclipse a year and a half ago, this is a nod to Eclipse, whereas Eclipse is a piece of steel that forms the inside, the power supply cover, and the outside. In this instance, it's two pieces. This part here and the inner part are two parts riveted together, for example. So I'm not suggesting that Cooler Master should just nick ideas from Phanteks, but what Phanteks did was very clever and it looks very good. If Cooler Master is going to kind of borrow from Phanteks, makes you wonder why they don't go the whole hog. Other detailed points that Cooler Master has spelled out and has done well. So for example, the front fans can mount outside the frame under this cover, whereas on the top they have to mount inside the frame. When you mount, for example, a 240mm liquid cooler in the front of this case, if you want to put it in any position you choose, and obviously there's a certain amount of latitude, you will very often find you have to ditch a couple of the mounting screws. If you put it in the correct position, you can use all 8. I've come across this a number of times with Cooler Master, and I genuinely have to wonder whether someone back at R&D in Cooler Master has actually built a variety of PCs into any given case. My suspicion is not. They do lots of things quite well, but when it comes to actually putting the whole thing together, there seem to be little sort of points. So for example, in this instance, when I put their MasterLiquid 240 cooler in the front, I found that routing the fan cables was tricky. Not the end of the world, so it's ended up with the cables going over and under, and it does indeed work. Nonetheless, there are no cable routing holes around the sides, and after all, fan plugs aren't that enormous. It's fairly obvious you're going to have to route the cables somehow, somewhere. The fact that they included this adapter cable in the package, I mean, that's to be welcomed, but that's sort of getting around an inherent problem, which would be relatively simply fixed actually just by stamping some holes. Building a PC into this case, you've essentially got, what, 3 ways of doing it. You can go for a really simple tower air cooler, such as their classic 212, which would go in absolutely easily. If you go for a sensible graphics card, sensible CPU, bump, you've saved yourself a bit of space on your desk with a smaller case, that's all great. I've obviously gone for the monster setup. Now there's a reason why I've gone with this Skylake X processor and Vega 64 graphics card. These are the same components I used recently in Corsair Carbide 678C. Now that case on the face of it had lousy airflow because the front was effectively sealed. Various other reviews just eviscerated that case. Mine was not quite so harsh because the actual numbers out of that case weren't so bad. It looked as though it would flow absolutely no air. In practice it works okay. I'm not a fan of it, but it does work okay. Interesting to compare the figures from this case with those same components with the Carbide 678, which is significantly larger. The CPU temperatures in this case are slightly lower than the Corsair, GPU temperatures significantly higher. Now you will see the graphics card in this is a monster. It's an Asus Vega 64 and it fills the available space. And as a result, it has to affect how air flows through the case. So I'm not the least bit surprised the GPU is starved of air. Nonetheless, the graphics card fits in sensibly, it's within spec, and it's suffering slightly. You can use it, but it's significantly warmer than it was in the Corsair. So the Corsair with fairly rotten airflow, but lots of space, worked this way. This case, which is somewhat more intelligent, but considerably more compact, CPU better, GPU significantly worse. Pulling off the front panel drops temperatures by a couple of degrees, makes next to no difference. That front panel does indeed flow air almost as though it isn't installed. It is like an open front panel, which goes back to my original point of it's quite a noisy case. It just is. I've got the fans currently set to silent mode. I was testing with them in normal mode. That was a little bit rackety. Crank up the speed to full or turbo or whatever, or extreme. It's just noisy. The other thing about the NR400 is it is surprising just how much storage you can cram in. Now you will have noted the various drives I've installed I have not connected. I'm running this system off an M.2 SSD on the motherboard. So were I to want to connect up the various drives I've got in there, there'd be more cables. It would be awkward. For example, if you mount SSDs on the power supply cover, I've got one there where the cables go in the back. It's going to clash, for example, potentially with USB connections at the foot of the board. You will find the cables are very close to those points. I think it is doable, but it would be tricky. There is not a lot of space in this case. It is indeed compact. However, you can get two SSDs on the power supply cover. You can get two SSDs behind the rear panel. You can get 3 hard drives in this caddy. Now, I installed 2 on these rails. You can put a 3rd in there. That's 4 screws that go in. It's a little bit of a cheat because Corsair actually refers to this being entirely tool-free, and for the 4 SSDs that's entirely true. You screw 4 pegs into the 4 mounting holes and you drop them into some rubbers. That is true. These 2 drives go on rails. If you want to put this drive in, you're going to end up putting 4 screws in, so you do actually have to use a screwdriver. Not entirely tool-free, pretty blooming good. Then you put the caddy in there, and the question is, do you actually have any space for it to go? If you're using a modular power supply, they generally take up more space because you have to have the cable connections, and if you've got RGB hardware and such like that has to go somewhere, there isn't really enough space for that caddy to go in the chassis. I think I could just about cram it in, but it would be tight. On the other hand, if I had a smaller power supply rather than Cooler Master's own modular power supply, if I didn't have RGB cabling to hide away, I'm quite certain that caddy would go in. That is a lot of storage to put in a micro ATX case. The funny thing is, if you have the optical, this is the NR400 without ODD, it's a specific data sheet. If you have the ODD version, obviously you have an ODD up top, that's going to take up a chunk of space, so it means any cooling is going to have to shift away. That would definitely lend itself, in my mind, to an air cooler. You actually gain another hard drive caddy. Reading the book of words, it goes below the ODD, so you can hang another drive. So that's 4 mechanical hard drives and 4 SSDs, which is just a crazy mental amount of storage, and you have to take your hat off to Cooler Master for that. So despite the fact it's small and compact, it has a great deal of potential. I also have to say that having the RGB fans behind this front panel, it does indeed work in exactly the way they said, and we saw at CES, which is it looks aesthetically really rather good. Doesn't get away from the point that it's also rather noisy. Overall then, a success. Happy days. Had it been £85? No, not a success. At £60, £59.99? Yes, hurrah. But that third point, or the second point, Micro ATX. Micro ATX continues to be a bit of a funny old thing. Micro ATX boards tend to be the poor relation of ATX. They're not only shorter and minus a few expansion slots, they also tend to have fewer features. So for example, this ASRock motherboard does indeed have ARGB headers, but it doesn't have the old 12 volt RGB headers, stuff like that. I mean, I'm not saying it's a problem, but it's just a fact of life. And you will naturally find a Micro ATX board has fewer fan headers. That is almost certain. So ATX fully featured gives you loads of options. Micro ATX saves you a bit of money and reduces your options. It's not just about space, there are other considerations. Having said all that, this build has worked out far better than I expected, and I've ended up happy. If you like this review, give it a thumbs up, look around, hit the bell button will alert you to new videos as they become available. There's Patreon somewhere and there's merch somewhere else. I'm Neil Woodard for Kit Guru. This is the Cooler Master MasterBox NR400.